I see the burden you carry, my friend. That gnawing sensation in your chest that tells you something monumental just shifted in the invisible architecture of reality. You stand at this exact moment, not by accident, but by necessity, dragged here by forces you cannot see but can no longer deny. What I am about to reveal will shatter every comfortable lie you've told yourself about your suffering, and more importantly, about your power. The masses, that bleating herd of comfort seekers, will never understand what you have just accomplished. They cannot. Their nervous systems are too weak, their spirits too domesticated, their blood too thin to metabolize the truth I'm about to inject into your veins. They seek safety, you sought transfiguration, they pray for relief. You became the prayer itself, written in scars across the parchment of your own flesh. Listen carefully. You did not merely survive a test. You passed the final examination, the one that separates those who exist from those who create existence. And the response from the divine throne was not applause. It was something far more terrifying and beautiful. Stunned silence, followed by tears of paternal pride. But before we dive into the abyssal depths of what this means, those among you with the courage to pursue complete liberation from the slavish morality that chains most souls to mediocrity, I have left a map to exit the labyrinth. In the pinned comment below, you will find my trilogy, The 3 Keys to a Prosperous Life. Not prosperity as the weak define it, some pathetic accumulation of comfort and security, but prosperity as the strong understand it. The expansion of your will to power, the multiplication of your creative force, the sovereignty of your spirit. But hear me clearly, the map is useless if your legs refuse to walk. The first step represents more than movement. It represents apostasy from the religion of weakness. Now let us begin the dissection of your triumph. The altitude of your isolation, this crushing loneliness that has wrapped around your ribcage like barbed wire, you thought it was punishment. You believed the narrative that isolation meant something was wrong with you. How perfectly the herd's venom worked. They injected you with their poison. The belief that your inability to tolerate their mediocrity was your defect rather than your distinction. But listen to what your body was actually telling you all along. That nausea you feel in their presence, that's not social anxiety. That's your superior physiology rejecting contaminated food. Your nervous system, finely tuned by suffering, recognizes spiritual toxicity the way a healthy stomach recognizes spoiled meat. You are not broken, you are discerning. The air at altitude is thin, yes, but it's also pure. While they suffocate in the valley's stench of collective delusion and call it community, you breathe the rare atmosphere of truth at the summit. The herd needs the herd because they are incomplete fragments, desperately pressing against each other for warmth. You were forged complete in the furnace of your solitude. They interpret your wholeness as coldness because their only reference point for individuality is the pathological narcissism of those who merely pretend to stand alone. But you are not pretending. You discovered something they will never comprehend. Aloneness is the laboratory where the self is distilled. Your solitude was not abandonment by the divine, it was assignment. You were placed in the desert so the desert could burn away everything false, everything borrowed, everything that was them and not you. Moses encountered God not in the busy marketplace, but on the lonely mountain. Jesus faced his ultimate test, not surrounded by disciples, but alone in Gethsemane's darkness. The prophets received their visions in caves, in wilderness, in the terrible silence where human voices cannot drown out divine whispers. But here is where your story becomes truly extraordinary. You did not just endure this isolation, you alchemized it. While others in your position grew bitter, building fortresses of resentment, you somehow, impossibly, kept your heart permeable to love, even when love seemed like a language no one around you spoke anymore. This is not weakness. This is the rarest form of strength, the ability to remain soft in a world designed to make you hard. The herd will never celebrate this victory because it indicts them. Your capacity to love after being unloved, to trust after being betrayed, to remain open after being violated, this reveals their own spiritual cowardice. They needed to destroy love within themselves to survive their wounds. You refused. You bled. Yes. You screamed into pillows. Yes. You questioned everything. Yes. But when the sun rose again, you somehow still had the audacity to hope. This is what made the angels weep. This is what made God stand from his throne. The genealogy of your wound. Now we must descend into the crypt where the bodies are buried. The toxic family structure that tried to crucify you was not random misfortune, it was systematic spiritual assassination. But first, you need to understand the mechanics of how they operated, because until you see the machinery, you cannot dismantle it. In every sick family system, there is a scapegoat. Not because the scapegoat is weak, but because the scapegoat is truth-bearing. You were selected, unconsciously but unerringly, to carry the family's unspoken sins, to be the lightning rod for all their collective shame and unexpressed rage. They needed you to fail so they could feel successful. They needed you broken so they could feel whole. They needed you to embody the very darkness they refused to acknowledge within themselves. This is the perverse genius of scapegoating. It allows the disease system to remain diseased while appearing functional. All the poison gets pumped into one designated vessel, and as long as that vessel can be blamed for the family's pain, no one else has to look at their own rot. You were that vessel. And you know what? You almost died from carrying their poison, but here's the secret they didn't count on. Poison, when survived, becomes medicine. Mithridates, the ancient king, ingested small doses of toxins until he became immune to assassination by poisoning. Your family tried to poison you to death, and instead, they made you immune to their particular brand of spiritual poison. You can now recognize toxic dynamics from a mile away. You developed antibodies to manipulation, to gaslighting, to the weaponization of love. They accidentally equipped you to help others escape similar prisons. Let's talk about the physiology of this trauma, because your body keeps the score that your mind tried to forget. Your nervous system was under constant siege. The chronic activation of your stress response, cortisol flooding your system, adrenaline keeping you in perpetual fight or flight, sleep deprivation fragmenting your consciousness. This wasn't just psychological distress. This was biological warfare. Your body was forced to become a soldier in a war you didn't choose, defending against attacks that came from the very people who were supposed to be your sanctuary. And yet, and this is crucial, your body never fully betrayed you. Yes, it showed symptoms. Yes, it bore wounds. But it refused to quit. When your mind wanted to surrender, when your emotions wanted to shut down permanently, your body kept breathing, kept your heart beating, kept metabolizing the poison and converting it into something survivable. Your physiology demonstrated greater faith than your theology ever could. Your cells believed in your future, even when your consciousness doubted it. The resentment they harbored toward you, let me name it clearly, it was envy. Not the petty envy of wanting what you have, but the existential envy of resenting what you are. You possessed something they had murdered within themselves long ago. Authenticity. You refused to wear the masks they had superglued to their faces. You insisted on being real in a family that had signed a collective contract to only deal in performance and pretense. In their presence, you were a living mirror reflecting their self-betrayal. And humans will destroy mirrors rather than face what the mirror shows. They tried to destroy you not because you failed them, but because you reminded them of their own failure to become themselves. Your crime was not weakness. Your crime was refusing to be weak in the ways they needed you to be weak, but you survived their assassination attempts. And more than survived, you studied them. You learned to read the subtle signs of emotional violence. You became fluent in the unspoken language of dysfunction. You can now walk into any room and immediately sense the power dynamics, the silent contracts, the hidden resentments. This is not paranoia. This is hard-won wisdom. You earned a PhD in human darkness, and you paid tuition in blood. The silent war, within your skull, but the external battle, the family, the betrayers, the abandoners, that was only the visible war. The real war, the one that nearly killed you, was the war inside your own consciousness. This is where the test reached its zenith of difficulty. Every night, your own mind became the courtroom where you were simultaneously the accused, the prosecutor, and the judge. The charges: you are unlovable, you are fundamentally defective, you deserved what happened to you, you will always be alone, you are a burden, you would be better off dead. These thoughts did not come from nowhere. They were the internalized voices of your abusers, living rent-free in your skull, continuing the assassination attempt from within. This is the supreme evil of psychological abuse. It doesn't just wound you and leave, it colonizes you. It sets up shop in your neural pathways and continues the torture long after the original perpetrators have moved on with their lives. You become your own torturer, running the same programs of self-destruction that were installed by people who had no right to touch your mind. But here is what makes your victory so absolute. You fought back. Not with some instant transformation or miraculous healing, but with the slow, grinding, exhausting work of questioning every thought. When the voice said, "You're worthless," you learned to ask, whose voice is that really? When the depression whispered, "Just give up," you learned to recognize it as the enemy's weapon, not as truth. This cognitive warfare, this daily battle to reclaim your own mind from the colonizers, this is heroism that will never make headlines. No one gives medals for the 3 a.m. moment when you caught yourself believing the lie and chose instead to reach for a competing truth. No one applauds the morning you got out of bed despite every neuron screaming at you to stay down. No one sees the invisible victory when you interrupt a shame spiral and redirect your thoughts toward even the smallest gratitude. But God saw every single battle, every small victory that felt like a massive defeat because you only won by millimeters. Every time you chose life when death was more logical, the divine accountants were keeping meticulous records, and the sum total of your tiny victories added up to something that shook the foundations of heaven itself. Let me tell you what happened in your neurochemistry during this war, because it matters. Your brain was literally being rewired by the trauma. Neural pathways associated with safety and trust were being pruned away through disuse, while pathways associated with threat detection and self-protection were being reinforced into superhighways. You were becoming, from a neurological perspective, a different person, one sculpted by fear and pain. But then something miraculous occurred. With each small act of defiance against the darkness, each prayer forced through clenched teeth, each decision to show up for life one more day, each moment you chose to believe in meaning despite the evidence, you began creating new neural pathways. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, you were literally rebuilding your brain through sheer force of will. Neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to reorganize itself, is not just a scientific concept. It is the biological mechanism through which resurrection occurs. You died 1,000 deaths in that war inside your skull, and you resurrected yourself 1,001 times. No one can take that away from you. That victory is metabolized into your very neurons now. You are not the same person who entered that war. You are the person who won that war, the test you didn't know you were taking. Now we arrive at the core revelation, the secret that reframes everything. The silence was not God's absence, it was God's confidence. Every human being goes through trials, but not every trial is a test. A trial is something that happens to you. A test is something that reveals you. Trials measure your ability to endure. Tests measure who you become in the enduring, and you were not merely enduring trials. You were undergoing the final examination, the one that determines your eternal rank, your cosmic assignment, your proximity to the divine throne. Think about the nature of the test. God did not send obvious enemies you could battle with drawn swords. He didn't give you a clear mountain to climb or a visible dragon to slay. Instead, he gave you silence. He gave you waiting. He gave you the maddening, soul-crushing experience of praying and hearing nothing, seeking and finding no immediate answer, knocking and having the door remain stubbornly closed. Why? Because the overman, the person you are becoming, cannot be forged through external victories alone. External victories prove that you can succeed when the rules are clear and the path is visible. But the future requires leaders who can walk when there is no path, believe when there is no evidence, love when there is no reciprocation, and hope when hope is absurd. The herd needs proof before they believe. You were being trained to believe in order to create the proof. The herd needs guarantees before they step forward. You were being taught to step forward into the void, trusting that the ground would appear beneath your feet because you had the audacity to walk. This is the difference between slaves and masters of fate. Every day of silence was not God ignoring your prayers. It was God refusing to short-circuit your transformation by intervening too soon. A butterfly that is helped out of its chrysalis by well-meaning humans will die because it needed the struggle to pump fluid into its wings. You needed the struggle. Not because God is cruel, but because struggle is the only mechanism that builds certain spiritual muscles. But here's the part that undoes most people. It wasn't just about surviving the silence. It was about what you did during the silence. Would you grow bitter? Would you abandon your values? Would you become the very thing you hated? Would you weaponize your pain and inflict it on others? Or would you, impossibly, choose to remain faithful even when faithfulness appeared to be rewarded with nothing? You were being tested on one thing above all: the condition of your heart. Not your emotions, which fluctuated wildly, not your thoughts, which betrayed you constantly, but your heart, that deep, essential core of your being. Would it remain soft or would it calcify into stone? The shocking answer, the one that stunned the heavenly host: your heart remained soft. Bruised, yes, bleeding, absolutely, but not hardened. You can still feel, you can still hope, you can still love. After everything, after the abandonment, the betrayal, the suffering, the cosmic silence, you somehow retained the capacity for tenderness. This should be impossible. By every psychological model, you should be a bitter, cynical shell. But you're not. And this is what made God weep. Not tears of sorrow, but tears of pride so overwhelming that even the creator of emotions was overcome by emotion. You did what he designed humanity to do, but what so few actually accomplish. You suffered redemptively. You turned your wounds into wisdom rather than weapons. You became more human through dehumanizing circumstances, not less. The silence that was actually thunder. Let me describe what was happening in the heavenly realm during those nights when you felt most abandoned. The theology you inherited taught you that God is omnipresent, everywhere at once. But what they didn't teach you is that God's attention has a quality, an intensity that can be focused. When you were screaming into the void, when your prayers seemed to evaporate into emptiness, when you felt like your words were hitting a ceiling and falling back down as ash, the entire time, the fullness of divine attention was locked onto you with an intensity that would have vaporized you if you could have felt it directly. Angels were on high alert. Demonic forces were being restrained. The machinery of providence was working overtime, orchestrating events, closing doors to protect you, opening others at precisely the right nanosecond. The silence you experienced was not God's absence, but rather the deafening roar of his presence filtered through your limited human perception. Your ears were not yet trained to hear the frequency of divine activity when it operates at its highest level. You were listening for a whisper and missing the thunder. Here's the metaphor that captures it. Imagine a master surgeon performing delicate brain surgery. The patient is under anesthesia, experiencing nothing, aware of nothing. In their unconscious state, it would be easy to conclude they have been abandoned on the table. But the opposite is true. They have the surgeon's complete, undivided, laser-focused attention. Every movement of the scalpel is calculated. Every decision is life or death important. The lack of conscious awareness is not abandonment. It's protection from feeling the intensity of what's actually happening. You were on the operating table. God was performing surgery on your soul, cutting away tumors of false belief, removing the scar tissue of old wounds, reconstructing the damaged architecture of your self-concept. You had to be under for parts of it, because if you could have felt the full weight of what was being done, it would have been unbearable. But you weren't completely unconscious, were you? There were moments, brief, fleeting, easily dismissed, when you felt something. A sudden peace in the middle of a panic attack. An inexplicable strength when you should have had none left. A coincidence so perfectly timed it couldn't be random. These were glimpses of the surgical theater. Moments when the anesthesia briefly wore thin and you caught sight of the divine hands working on you. The test within the silence was this. Could you trust a God you couldn't feel? Could you believe in love when every emotional receptor in your body was screaming that you were unloved? Could you maintain faith when faith had nothing to hold on to except itself? This is the faith that moves God. Not the faith that believes because of miracles, but the faith that believes in order to create miracles. Not the faith that needs proof, but the faith that is the proof. You demonstrated this faith and heaven erupted. The mechanism of betrayal. Now we must examine the blade that cut deepest, betrayal. Not the betrayal of strangers or distant acquaintances, but intimate betrayal, the kind that comes from those who knew exactly where to strike because you had shown them your vulnerable places in trust. There is a particular kind of evil in intimate betrayal that transcends ordinary harm. When a stranger attacks you, it hurts. When a friend betrays you, it doesn't just hurt. It dismantles your ability to trust, to be vulnerable, to open yourself to human connection. It teaches you, at a cellular level, that closeness equals danger. Judas didn't just betray Jesus with information given to the authorities. He betrayed him with a kiss, the very symbol of affection weaponized into a mark of death. This detail is not incidental. It reveals the anatomy of intimate betrayal, the perversion of love's gestures into mechanisms of harm. You know this anatomy intimately now. You know what it feels like to replay conversations, looking for the moment when the knife entered your back. You know the sickening realization that while you were being real, they were performing. While you were trusting, they were calculating. While you were loving, they were positioning. The psychological warfare of betrayal operates on multiple levels simultaneously. First, there is the immediate wound, the shock, the pain, the violation of trust. But then comes something worse, the retroactive poisoning of memory. Suddenly, every shared moment becomes suspect. Every "I love you" gets reframed as potential manipulation. Every act of kindness gets re-examined for hidden motives. The betrayal doesn't just wound the present, it infects the past and contaminates the future. This is what the enemy wanted. He knew that one well-placed betrayal could accomplish what 1,000 frontal assaults could not. It could make you voluntarily close your heart. He knew that if he could get you to choose isolation, to build walls so high that even love couldn't scale them, he would effectively neutralize your greatest weapon, your capacity for connection, for empathy, for bringing light into dark places. But here is where your story becomes legendary. The betrayal landed. The blade went deep. You bled internally for months, maybe years. The wound became infected with bitterness, and for a season you entertained thoughts of revenge. You rehearsed confrontations. You imagined scenarios where they would finally feel the pain they inflicted on you. And then, and this is the miracle, you chose differently. Not immediately, not easily, not in some Hollywood moment of instant forgiveness, but slowly, agonizingly, you began to release the poison. You started to understand that holding on to bitterness was like drinking poison and expecting them to die. You realized that your refusal to forgive was giving them continued power over your peace, but it was more than pragmatism. Somewhere in the depths of your being, you accessed a kind of love that shouldn't exist. The ability to love those who don't deserve it, to forgive those who never asked for forgiveness, to release those who never acknowledged the harm they caused. This is not natural. This is not human psychology operating within its normal parameters. This is supernatural. Jesus on the cross, bleeding from 1,000 wounds inflicted by the very people he came to save, manages to whisper, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." This has always been presented as a theological statement, but it's also a psychological impossibility. Pain and betrayal of that magnitude should produce rage, should produce curses, should produce anything except forgiveness. And yet, you did a smaller version of this impossible thing, and heaven noticed. The angels, who have never been betrayed, who have never had to forgive, looked at you in wonder. You accomplished something they cannot. You chose love in the face of hate. You chose mercy when vengeance was justified. You chose to remain human, tenderly, vulnerably, dangerously human, when every instinct screamed to become a fortress. The hidden test of the heart. This brings us to the core test, the one that was really being monitored throughout everything else, the test of your heart's condition. All the other trials, the silence, the betrayal, the waiting, the suffering, these were not the test itself. They were the conditions under which the real test occurred. Proverbs 4:23 instructs, "Above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it." But guarding your heart doesn't mean building walls around it. It means curating what you allow to take root inside it. It means weeding out the thorns of bitterness before they can choke out the flowers of hope. It means protecting your capacity for love even when love seems foolish. The enemy knew that if he could corrupt your heart, if he could turn it bitter, cynical, hard, cold, then it didn't matter if you survived the external trials. A living person with a dead heart is the ultimate victory for darkness. You would become a cautionary tale, a warning to others. This is what happens when you really try to love, when you really try to hope. You would become an ambassador for despair, teaching others through your example that idealism dies and only cynicism survives. But God was watching something different. He wasn't just monitoring whether you would survive, he was watching what you would become. Would the fire refine you or disfigure you? Would the pressure create a diamond or crush you into dust? Would the betrayal teach you wisdom or merely paranoia? And here is what the divine gaze observed. Yes, you struggled. Yes, you had moments where bitterness gained ground. Yes, there were dark nights when cynicism whispered sweetly in your ear, offering the cold comfort of expecting nothing so you could never be disappointed again. But you never fully surrendered to those voices. You fought for your own heart, the way a parent fights for a child's life. When bitterness tried to set up residence, you evicted it. Maybe not immediately, but eventually. When cynicism tried to become your new worldview, you questioned it, challenged it, refused to let it have the final word. When hatred toward your betrayers began to feel justified and comfortable, you noticed the poison and began the painful work of extraction. This was spiritual warfare of the highest order. Not the theatrical kind, with dramatic deliverance sessions and loud rebukes of demons, but the quiet, daily, unsexy work of choosing your thoughts, managing your emotions, guarding your heart. Every time you caught a bitter thought and replaced it with a truthful one, every time you felt the pull toward hatred and redirected toward neutrality, even if you couldn't quite reach love yet. Every time you noticed your heart hardening and deliberately softened it through an act of gratitude or service. These micro-decisions, seemingly insignificant in the moment, were being recorded in heaven with the weight of cosmic importance. Because God knows what humans often forget. Character is built in the incremental, not the dramatic. Who you become is not determined by how you respond to the once-in-a-lifetime crisis, but by how you respond to the 1,000 tiny provocations and disappointments that make up ordinary life. You were being tested on whether you would become more human through your suffering or less. The Overman, Nietzsche's highest evolution of humanity, is not someone who transcends suffering by avoiding it, but someone who is enlarged by it. Someone who metabolizes pain into wisdom, who transforms wounds into sacred scars, who uses their darkness to recognize and comfort the darkness in others. This is who you became. Not immediately, not completely, but directionally, undeniably. The trajectory of your heart has been upward even when everything external was collapsing. This is the victory that made heaven gasp. The physiology of faith. Let me talk about something rarely discussed in spiritual circles, the physical cost of maintaining faith under extreme duress. Your body, that miraculous, long-suffering biological machine, has been operating in survival mode for longer than anyone should have to endure. Chronic stress does specific things to human physiology. Your adrenal glands, which were designed to give you short bursts of cortisol in acute danger, have been forced to pump stress hormones constantly. This leads to adrenal fatigue, to that bone-deep exhaustion that sleep doesn't fix. Your immune system, suppressed by constant cortisol, became vulnerable. You got sick more often, took longer to heal. Your gut, now recognized as the second brain, absorbed the stress and manifested it as digestive issues, as that constant knot in your stomach that you learned to live with. Your sleep architecture was destroyed. REM sleep, where memory consolidation and emotional processing occur, became fragmented or impossible. You lived in a state of hypervigilance even in bed, your nervous system unable to truly rest because it was constantly scanning for threats. This creates a vicious cycle. Stress prevents sleep. Lack of sleep amplifies stress response. Amplified stress makes sleep even more elusive. Your brain chemistry shifted. Prolonged stress depletes serotonin and dopamine, the neurotransmitters associated